Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for one event in our Conversations series. So what we're doing in these conversations is I am Apter Bairnsfather. I'm director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, and I am bringing conversations that I get to have usually behind the scenes to light so that everyone can learn from the amazing people that I get to talk to in my role. So you may know that the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh is deeply engaged with communities throughout the city of Pittsburgh and the region of southwestern Pennsylvania. I am joined by Jason England, who is assistant professor in the Department of English at Carnegie Mellon University. I'll tell you a little bit more about him, and then we'll get down to our conversation, which I am really looking forward to. Jason England graduated from Wesleyan University with high honors and 3 awards for fiction. He got his MFA from the Iowa Writers' Workshop and was the Carl Djerassi Fiction Fellow at the Wisconsin Institute. Jason's short fiction has been anthologized, and his essays on race, sports, and societal issues have appeared in various publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Root, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. He is concurrently finishing his first novel and a collection of essays. Jason, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I left out one thing that I think is relevant, which is that we are next door neighbors, and we'll share a link to an incredible project called Mapping Inequality that shows redlining of real estate. And we are neighbors now in a community that would have been hostile to either of us living here in the 1930s when this project was put together. And I have that in mind as I'm talking to you, and I'm always grateful to you for talking to me just about what is on your mind and what's been going on. So just for our viewers who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and where you come from, how you came to be assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I'd like to add that it's always pleasant to talk to you, and I couldn't have a better neighbor next door. It's been the transition to Pittsburgh, a really good one. Yeah, I don't know. That's a long story. How did I come to be at Carnegie Mellon as a professor? I don't know some days. When I wake up, I try to trace it. I feel very fortunate. And I think, you know, we've spoken a bit about this, about the need to be thankful in life, to recognize how much of life is circumstance and luck, no matter how hard you work. And so I took a strange journey. You know, I was born and raised in New York City in the 80s. My mother and I were homeless in New York in the 80s, and we were in a welfare hotel in Times Square. And back then, it was one of the worst neighborhoods in New York City. And certainly the building we lived in was profiled in the New York Times. It was a drug den, prostitution den. They were down and out families who were surrounded by criminals. And those were rough years for us. We lived there for 5 years. I also lived in a house project in Harlem. I got a scholarship to a prep school called Salisbury. It was an all-boys Episcopalian school. I'm not Episcopalian. And it changed my life. Partially, it gave me a perspective I just never would have had otherwise. You know, the education was totally fine, but it's really the social education I got. It expanded my view of the world, and also the mechanisms that shaped the world I was in. I'd always been looking for this, a sort of justification, right? I think we all are when we're young. Why are we where we are? Right? How do we make sense of our own situation? How do we do the sorting and the self-sorting and understand, why my mom and I are in a welfare hotel, or, why some family members are in a housing project? And what does it mean to be smart or successful? And you're finding out a bit more at every stage. And so I ended up at this all-boys prep school, which I would say was kind of like Lord of the Flies, but worse. And I graduated from there, and I went to North Carolina Chapel Hill. It wasn't for me. It was too large of a school. I wasn't ready for college emotionally. There was so much I was dealing with in terms of my background and family members who were in trouble, having to support myself. I left. I worked in civil rights, a job I shouldn't have had because I was green, but I quit it myself well, and I worked there for 3 years. And my boss said, you're young and talented and smart. You got to go back to school. And so I applied again. I went to Wesleyan University, which is where I got my bachelor's. And I just had the time of my life. It was wonderful to go back, at 21 years old. I always say it's hard at 18, 17, even 19 to know what you want to do and to appreciate what a gift it is to be on a college campus around your peers who are excited about knowledge and, these faculty members who are experts at what they teach and who want to work with you, particularly at a small liberal arts school. And I just had the time of my life. It was like being at Club Med. I couldn't believe I got to take these classes and hang out on a hill and talk to other smart kids who were energetic and wanted to talk and engage about real world issues that were pertinent to us. And I think there was a real energy there that I hadn't seen elsewhere, a sense of purpose. And I left there and I worked. Well, I didn't really leave. They offered me a job as one of the deans of admissions. And my girlfriend at the time was studying astrophysics, and she had a fellowship for 1 year before doing her PhD on campus. And I thought it was that or an internship at the New York Times. And the Times internship was prestigious, but it was unpaid. And I didn't know how I could live in New York without any salary. And I knew, and I don't want to say I was naive because I still believe it. I knew that I loved the person I was with, and that love was important enough to choose a job for at that moment for me to stay close to this person. And so I did admissions, and I'm a New Yorker, so I didn't know how to drive. I've been taking buses and trains my entire life. Driving was impractical in the city. And so in 1 month, I had to learn to drive in order to be a dean of admissions because I was flying all over the country and renting cars and, driving to high schools and information sessions. And I got this look up close to circle back to what I was talking about the social mechanisms that shape us and how we end up where we are and how we become successful. Suddenly I was in the sausage factory, as it is. I saw how the sausages got made. And it was fascinating for 1 year. And by the second year, it was exhausting because it was morally complicated. It made me feel bad. I was saying no to a lot of people. And by the third year, I'd figured out why I was saying yes or no. And then that became very depressing. We had a mandate and certainly a stated belief in diversity at Wesleyan. Yeah. But what we meant by that was peculiar. And the different people who were hurt by our admissions process, I think, was really peculiar. I left the school with a bizarre sympathy for white women. I didn't expect to feel that way. But the process at Wesleyan really ground them up, and spit them out. Really overqualified white female applicants from the Northeast, who should have gotten in easily. There were so many of them in the pool that they ended up going to their fourth and fifth choice sometimes. People don't talk about that when they talk about affirmative action. They don't talk about gender affirmative action. It's not something that people even stop to consider. But we had a lot of mediocre men who were being admitted in order to maintain that 50-50 gender balance, and a lot of women who probably thought, my God, like what more do I need to do? Why don't they love me? And that's without getting into different things in terms of race and class and all of these factors in the admissions process that are pretty invisible to most people who aren't familiar with the inner workings of it. And so I left admissions. It had made me feel bad and complicit, and I decided to pursue creative writing. And I went to the IRA Writers Workshop, or I should say I was lucky enough to be admitted into the IRA Writers Workshop. It's a pretty good program.
Yeah, great program.
And I was fortunate. I studied there with Marilyn Robinson, among others, and I had just a great time intellectually, creatively. I loved Iowa City, and I joke with people, but I mean it. I never thought growing up in New York City that I would genuinely consider Iowa City a second home, but I do. I go back frequently. It's a wonderful community, terrific place to be in the summer, especially. It's sort of like a hidden gem. And I worked at a few universities. I got a couple of fellowships to teach creative writing at Iowa, at Madison, in Wisconsin. And, I worked for friends in Hollywood. I did some admissions consulting, mostly pro bono, because I think there are ethical issues with admissions consulting. And then I taught public speaking, I taught rhetoric, I taught critical thinking at the University of Iowa, and I got the job offer at Carnegie Mellon 3 years ago, and that's what brought me here. Along the way, I was a soda salesperson. I was a bartender. I was a waiter. I worked as a parking lot attendant. I wore many hats, and my journey here was extremely improbable, especially from early. As a kid in the 1980s New York, who was homeless and fighting through really bad public schools, and I was fortunate to have a few women in my life. My mother being one who was very depressed and had some difficulties, but was determined to make sure her son continued to get transferred from public school to public school until I found one that took me seriously. My mother's determination was incredible. And then along the way, other women who believed in me. We talked once about a woman named Geraldine Charney, who I think could not stand me when she met me as a student. I was aloof. I sat in the back row. And I think to some extent I was ashamed of being an intellectually curious nerd. And so I had adopted this sort of aloof persona. I was too cool for school. I would lean back in my seat and she would yell at me for leaning all the time. And then I submitted a paper to her and she called my mom into the school and I thought I was in trouble. And she told my mom, your son has been bothering me in class all year. And then I just got this paper and I realized he is very intelligent. We have to do something with him. He was the one who put me on a bus to go visit a prep school. And the rest is, history. But different people took interest in me. I had a mentor in college, Gail Pemberton, wonderful essayist who's taught at Princeton, Wesleyan, Mount Holyoke, Reed College, all over, has won great teaching awards, just phenomenal human, an amazing scholar, a great teacher. And again, that was someone who spotted me in a classroom and had a meeting with me and said, you need to be doing bigger things. And so, I mentioned that mostly because mentorship is such an important thing in my life. And good fortune, I have been homeless, sure. I did live in a housing project. I've had financial struggles because of those things. I've lost people. My best friend was killed when I was 18. My cousin who I grew up with, who was like a brother, was shot and killed as well when I was 24, right before I graduated Wesleyan, 2 weeks before. And yet I can still look at the totality of my journey and I can say I've been extremely lucky. I've had people take interest at the right time. I've caught breaks. I've been put in the right networks. And then once I was placed in those networks, I worked my tail off, and took advantage of them. But circumstance has been kind to me because it's pulled me, out of sort of the scrap heap, where some of us are unlucky enough to be born, and it's placed me among just absolutely wonderful opportunities. So I'm thankful. That was a long way of saying I'm happy to be here.
It was a really interesting response. And just to pull out a couple things and not to sidetrack us too much, but I spent a lot of years at the University of Texas where, the case Abigail Fisher was denied admission to the University of Texas, that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was exactly what you're talking about, like why she was not admitted to the University of Texas. So that's interesting. And we'll talk about that another time because, as you know, my background is higher ed as well. And I'm really interested in all of your experiences there. There's so much we can talk about, but let's stick with this kind of university theme. Especially, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about race at universities. And I know you shied away from talking about race with admissions, but whatever you're willing to share with us about your experience with race at universities. We started this conversation right after the murder of George Floyd, when everybody was putting out a statement and the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh put out a statement. We had a conversation about that. So maybe that's a jumping off point.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a great segment of a James Baldwin essay that I loved. When I was 19, I read just about everything he wrote. And he's become he's back in vogue. I think because of Coates's book, Between the World and Me. There are a lot of Baldwin references. And it's like Baldwin, you'd almost think he's the only Black intellectual who ever existed these days. And so I feel a little bit guilty referencing him. But he had this great thing. He was talking about American society. And he was saying, race is like the dead mother in the closet. It's like if you go over to your buddy's house and he killed his mom and he stuffed her in the closet. You cannot have a conversation unless you address the dead mother in the closet, because every conversation will be you avoiding that. It won't be a natural conversation. It's the conversation you're having instead of the conversation, and you're always aware of it in some way, shape, or form. So race is treated that way. It's hard for people to talk about. They tiptoe around it. They're afraid to admit they don't understand it, because there are plenty of people who just don't understand. It's not like race is a simple issue. There's scholarship on this for a reason. It is complicated. There is nuance. There is history. There's context. And if they do understand it, or even regardless if they don't understand it, people are terrified to talk about it because they're worried about the audience. Who am I going to offend here? With universities, I think they enjoy talking about race if it's something they can show off. It exists almost as it's like a nice centerpiece in a room. It brings the room together. It's like a conversational piece. Look at this beautiful, we've got diversity here. Look at this is a great Black student I have here, and we have 18 of them on the campus. And isn't that fantastic? And doesn't that validate us, in our values and our commitment to it? But when they have to deal with the difficult topics that inevitably surface around race, they start to micromanage. They're very worried about what they're going to say. And so I think universities suffered from that with George Floyd. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to address protesters. I know at Carnegie Mellon, it was people, when the statements came out, they didn't want to say they supported protesters. But some of those protesters were their faculty and their students who were putting their bodies in harm's way. And so then it was, well, we support peaceful protesters. But protesting by nature isn't peaceful. And also something that history has taught us is that however you protest, in whatever form, someone will take issue with it. There is no correct way to protest, So protesters was enough, I thought. But Carnegie Mellon initially really tried to avoid the topic of race at all, and they have a history of doing this in their statements. When a police officer, shoots a fleeing teen in Pittsburgh, the statement doesn't reference the officer's race. At CMU, the statement doesn't really talk about the racial dynamic or the implications or the suspicions that people have why this person was shot. They try to avoid that, avoid liability, avoid, I'm sure, offending different trustees, different investors, different segments of the Carnegie Mellon community. And in doing so, they do this sort of a tightrope walk in which they please no one, really, and they offend everyone. And they avoid reality. They avoid reckoning with reality. And an institution of higher learning, that's the one place where you are supposed to reckon with history, reckon with reality and circumstance. You're supposed to distill that reckoning down into accessible terms for the rest of us who work 9 to 5s and don't have the time to do that distillation. And it seems that these universities view themselves as such corporate models that they avoid doing the work that in their mission they say they should be doing, that they claim to do, right? So CMU's initial statement was vague. It didn't discuss any history. It didn't contextualize anything. It really was a non-statement, and so two of us in the English department, in fact, the only two Black males and Black people in the English department at the moment, we co-wrote an essay for the Chronicle, not just singling out Carnegie Mellon, but generally these university statements were toothless. They didn't actually say anything. They didn't support anything. They didn't attempt to do the work a university does, which is knowledge creation, parsing, intellectual analysis. It was more like Coca-Cola putting out a statement and protecting its market, And in fact, what we pointed out was that some corporations, in fact, most of them, issued stronger statements than most universities. Ben and Jerry's being the extreme example, But when you live in a society where corporations are actually outdoing universities in terms of their moral compass, then we've turned upside down in a way that disturbs me.
I think this is a challenge that many nonprofits face, and a university is a nonprofit, that we have certain donor bases and we need to be sensitive to how we talk about things and how we say things. What you're saying about the role of a university resonates with me for what we're trying to do at the Holocaust Center, a much smaller organization, obviously, but we are guided by history. So we see the facts of history. This is extremely painful today, especially. We were in touch yesterday, and you actually alerted me to a trend on Twitter that was hashtag Jewish privilege, which was really an unleashing of vile anti-Semitic posts all over Twitter. And then there was a Jewish response, which is what came up when I searched for hashtag Jewish privilege, from a lot of people trying to explain what anti-Semitism is and how serious it is. And frankly, it's weighing on me really heavily, because we are guided by history. We understand a 400-year history that led us to this moment, to 6 weeks of Black Lives Matter protests. We absolutely believe in being an anti-racist organization. What I saw on Twitter was the people who hate all of us. It was really the hashtag Jewish privilege was being used by white supremacists. And that's an important thing that I keep in mind all the time, that there needs to be a natural alliance that I think should exist. Layered with that, we had Deshaun Jackson last week posting some anti-Semitic material on social media. So then that's another layer to this. There's the white supremacists who are against all minorities, and then there are tensions that are existing between Black Lives Matter and the Jewish community. It's very, very complicated, obviously, but I wonder if you can help me out here.
Yeah, the human condition is very complicated. Society is very complicated and tragic, disappointing, you know. But it's Albert Schweitzer who said, you know, he said something about his knowledge of the world is pessimistic, but his belief in the will of individuals is optimistic. And that resonates with me, you know. I don't know where to begin with that. You know, obviously, this is a nation that has some serious reckoning to do with the history of white supremacy in the country. It does. It's a nation that claims to value history but doesn't actually study its own history. And in fact, actively attempts to revise it more strongly than ever. You know, it's not new, you know, especially you haven't been in Texas. You know, I recall when Texas public schools were revising history actively for public schooling, you know, textbooks, you know, slavery described in different terms, some events left out completely from the record. This is sociopathic. And I don't mean that to impugn the nation. I mean that in terms of characterizing the behavior. The idea that you can commit a crime and then just say, well, it never happened, is very sociopathic, right? And it doesn't lead to any real development. You know, this is a nation that at its best, what I find fascinating about it when you look back across the history of it, is whether or not it has the best history, there was a sense spiritually that it was a nation that was reckoning with its history and moving forward, right? And for me, that's what being progressive meant. Absent of any connotations of liberal or conservative, I viewed as a team, you know, certainly America as a progressive country, that we were moving towards something stronger, better, that we were reviewing this history and we were slowly trying to get things right and build a better society. And we've regressed, and that is disappointing. You know, it's disheartening to read these things on Twitter, but I suppose that the white supremacist rhetoric is not as disheartening because I expect it. And it's simple, it's buffoonish, it's trollish, it's awful, but you have to have a thick skin to get through the world. And it's so cartoonish that I ignore that to the extent I can online. Now, Deshaun Jackson's statements, I can't say I saw them, and it's because I chose not to. I know they happened. I don't like reading that kind of gibberish. It embarrasses me. I can imagine what he said, and I heard a couple people who came to his defense and supported him. I heard some of the rationalizations to justify what he might really have meant, that sort of thing. You know, I'm from New York City. I've heard every anti-Jewish conspiracy that's ever been thrown around. sometimes from members of my own family. And obviously, there's a long history of alliance between the Black and Jewish community. And it's a complicated history. It's changed throughout the decades. It's evolved and devolved. But one thing that we have to be honest about is that this sort of shared experience that Blacks and Jews have in the loosest way of persecution, marginalization, a history of oppression doesn't preclude any single Black person or Jewish person from being prejudiced or biased or uninformed and obnoxious, or from wanting to shape reality in terms of, instead of observing reality and then analyzing, reality, wanting to fit reality to shape reality to fit their biases, their preconceived notions. People scapegoat. Simpletons do, and bad people do, and people who are scared of the world, they want these conspiracy theories to be true because it simplifies the world. It allows you to view individuals in terms of good and bad, and whose fault it is, and who you can blame for your lot in life, and that sort of thing. And that was tired to me at age 7. I was lucky enough to have a mother who told me that was not the way to be. And I was also lucky enough to be a product of the New York public school system. It wasn't strange for me to see anyone, it wasn't strange for me to see Haitian people, people from all across Africa. Certainly, I was shocked when I left New York that Jewish people weren't everywhere, because there were so many Jewish people that I had gone to school with and been friends with, and who have been my teachers and mentors. So the lack of familiarity with Jewish culture is certainly, it hurts, because these conspiracy theories have been amplified so much in the era of social media. That people who are just online, searching YouTube videos or looking at God knows what else, can easily get this information and run with. Did he mention the Rothschilds or something? Was it one of those cliche sort of things? I can't remember what
it was very strange. He misattributed a quote to Hitler, but then it was the response from a basketball player in Houston.
Sure.
He fell back on those very 100-year-old
sure
Jewish anti-Semitic stereotypes.
I don't have a lot of sympathy for that sort of thing, but I think accountability is important, and I've always felt that way. I don't think it's enough to say, well, Black people are also persecuted and we're rough, and we're coming from this perspective and we've had it bad, and that's no excuse for not having the information or the desire to receive the information and seek the information out to debunk this sort of silly stereotype in these conspiracy theories. And the other way around, I have very good friends from college who are Jewish, and we talk about this frequently. There is enmity and contempt and prejudice between just about every group. Everyone has an aunt, everyone has an uncle, a grandfather, or a friend who says something that they find absolutely appalling. And doubly so, because it's like, there are people who think you are the scourge of the earth, and here you are sort of reappropriating that contempt for someone else, as if you don't know how it feels to feel it. And that is particularly disheartening to me. And so I think, one, people have to be held accountable when they do this. They have to be. And if you care about someone, you don't make excuses for them. You educate them. You take them to task. It's difficult. I don't understand that difficulty as much as other people do, but I do want to respect that it's difficult. I was a born arguer. My mother said that before I could speak, I was arguing with her. Quite true, making noises in the stroller. My mother and I have a wonderful and deep relationship, but our dynamic was such that I was taught to question things. She smoked when I was young in an apartment in New York City, and I thought this was outrageous. At age 9, I was yelling at my mother. It was like I was a lawyer. I was explaining what secondhand smoke did. I had read a study, and if I could take my mom to task for her smoking habit, and Lord knows I've taken my mom to task for certain opinions she's had as well, then I don't think it's too much to ask for other people to take their friends and their family to task when they say something that ultimately brings them down. It's degrading to the person who holds and spreads these opinions. What you're doing really, and this is how I've always looked at it, is I feel I'm doing a favor for this person. I feel that someone in Deshaun Jackson's circle would not be doing a favor to Jewish people. He'd be doing a favor to Deshaun Jackson to say, hey, man, you know what? You sound like an idiot. And you need to apologize. Or before you hit that send button, you might want to read something here. You're about to offend a whole lot of people and make yourself look like a village idiot. And this has been my view on racism since I was young. And I'm not the first to articulate this. I think Toni Morrison, had this great thing about racism where she said, I always knew it wasn't me. And if I wasn't the problem, then who was? The racist was. So I felt pity for racists. And when I correct people, when I try to edify them, when I tell them that you sound like a moron and you don't know what you're talking about, I am doing that out of sympathy. Not because I'm trying to protect myself, but because you are not a fully actualized human. If you believe these things, and this was Brown versus the Board of Ed. This is something people always forget. Kenneth Clark, the renowned black psychologist who wrote the footnote for the Brown versus Board of Ed case, what his study found was not that segregation was harmful to black children, although it certainly was, but it was that it was harmful to everyone, that it turned everyone involved, majority or minority group, into a sort of moral monster, into an incomplete human. And this was something the man I worked for in civil rights used to point out about the school shootings. Now, there's not much to point out. There are so many. But back when there was Columbine and they weren't every other day or every other week, and there were only a handful, he kept noticing that they were in these sort of emotionally sterile, homogeneous suburbs. And he would say, there's something about having an incomplete morality, about having no one around you that allows you to scapegoat groups more easily, that makes you view people as inhuman and allows you to do things that would seem unthinkable to the rest of us. And I believe that that's a bit of a leap on his part, but I believe that there is a grain of truth in there. And so, yeah, I think the segregation in America, which has never been corrected. We attempted, for sure, historically, but it's never really been addressed. It's hurt us morally. It's hurt us in terms of understanding each other as individuals, and it's definitely exaggerated a sense of tribalism that allows people to excuse the sort of things that Deshaun Jackson or said. I don't ascribe to that sort of tribalism and that sort of rationalization. I think what he said was abhorrent. And I don't think that you can play, this sort of a balancing act of oppression that a lot of people like to say. It's okay to say this if you are this, or if you suffered this, then that. Or because one time, a white player said something racist and wasn't punished as much as we would like him to have been, then maybe Deshaun shouldn't be as, his penalty shouldn't be as harsh, because then we balance it. That's not how it works. And that's the reason that, again, to circle back to what I said about race, that's why you have to have intelligent, informed discourse about this sort of thing. Because a sports commentator's expertise is not race, not even if he's black. That doesn't qualify you to discuss the nuance and history of race in this country. You need people, and certainly you have this, if we were to talk about, maybe these days it's not quite the same as it used to be, but if we were to talk about, astronomy, we would find someone with a PhD in astronomy to discuss that. If you were to talk about history for a special, you would find a historian. But for some reason, when you talk about things like racism, any garden variety person on a sports show becomes an expert, And it's disrespectful to the topic. And then that's how you get people like Deshaun Jackson who feel empowered, to speak about very complicated, sensitive matters in the stupidest way possible.
Yes. I mean, yes to everything you just said. It is really challenging. And another thing that social media does is it makes experts of everybody, especially, I mean, he has 1.4 million followers, I think. So, I mean, what a platform. And people will listen because we idolize sports heroes. And, this was in Philadelphia. The Eagles won a Super Bowl. This is big, and we love our football. And there was a really heartfelt response from Zach Banner, who plays for the Steelers. And I thought that was fantastic. And then there was also a response from Julian Edelman from the Patriots, coming from a Jewish perspective, which was also encouraging. I felt like the Jewish responses to the hashtag Jewish privilege, I was so frustrated because why do we have to do that? How educational is that? And it's a challenge for Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, for Holocaust educators. When we teach about the Holocaust, we want to teach about it for its own sake, but also because of what we learn from it. And we learn about one word that you used earlier, complicity. We learn about complicity. And I agree with you. We can't be silent. I read all of those tweets last night, really trying to figure out how I can not be silent about this, but say something more meaningful than try to get someone to understand what happened in the Holocaust as a reason not to say that there's Jewish privilege. I mean, I think it's scary. Anti-Semitism, which I did not experience very much growing up, which never really scared me, terrifies me now because we had an attack on a synagogue here. 3 different congregations lost members that day, October 27th, 2018. It's serious. It's a risk. It's dangerous. Just as racism remains dangerous, it's time. It's time to speak up and, to do what we can on whatever level we have. On whatever level we have where we can do something.
Well, what you said just now resonates with me when you said, you were looking at Jewish people responding. You've already lost at that point, right? My feeling is this: my humanity and my dignity are non-negotiable. If you have to argue with someone about your humanity, you've already lost. Right? It's not to say that you shouldn't argue that you deserve it. Right. It's that anyone you are reasoning with is not reasonable if you have to prove to them that you are a human being. And that's frustrating to watch. You can't win. And you're right. Social media, and I'm sure that some people will find me to be a fuddy-duddy for saying this, but I think it's one of the worst things, if not the worst thing, to happen in my lifetime. There's been a downward democratization of all things, a deregulation of all markets, intellectual and cultural. And like you said, it's like a junior high school lunchroom. Deshaun Jackson could be a complete nincompoop, but he does have 1.4 million followers, and therefore anything the nincompoop says will be spread farther than what an expert says, right? Who might not be narcissistic and self-promotional enough to grow a following, or perhaps doesn't even find any value in expressing trite thoughts every single day on social media. But this is a larger issue that people have to reckon with. And, like I said, being Black, being Jewish, being whatever does not preclude you from the possibility that you could also be a biased or a bad person toward other people, right? Similarly, I think that on the left, so many people have viewed what has happened with government and institutions that they cherish. And they see people being installed who they don't view as qualified. And they see these institutions being deregulated, reduced to cronyism. But I also see that on the left in terms of the marketplace of ideas, which is to say that the New York Times and different magazines, the prestige magazines, the Atlantic, that these are businesses. They rely on clicks too. And the market has shifted so that no matter how smart you are, if people aren't willing to click on your piece, it's difficult to justify running you, especially as print media is phased out. almost completely. And so sometimes even the intellectuals we hear from are more popular than they are thoughtful. And I worry about that sometimes as well, because we've never needed clear thinking more. We've never needed sound, educated, informed people of integrity to make sense of things more than we do now. And I fear that we're losing those people to an era they don't quite understand and are being phased out of. So these things I think about quite often.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about them too, obviously. And it's like a narrowing of perspective when you only have certain voices get any attention. And I think so. I'm with you now more than we need to hear from true experts. We need to preserve humanity. We need to preserve our own humanity and see the humanity in other people. And this is a message that we get very strongly from our Holocaust survivor speakers. And thank goodness we have them, because they're a model for us. Like, we know that there's another way. We know that we shouldn't be deterred because there are still people who would do us harm. Quite the contrary, we know that there are things we can do to show our humanity and to invite them to show us their humanity. It's in there. I really believe that it's in there. What you said about being part of a minority doesn't mean that you have beliefs that may be false. This is true too. So when I'm thinking about the work that communities can do to support each other, really thinking about the Black community and the Jewish community specifically, we need to root out those elements within our own communities to the extent that we're united communities, which of course is an oversimplification. I mean, the work continues. So on that note, we've now seen 6 weeks plus of protests for Black Lives Matter. And it's happening at the same time as COVID-19. So I can honestly say the COVID-19 era, the fact that we're having a spike again, that we're homebound again, it's just an experience that can't be compared to anything else I have ever experienced. But at the same time, these protests continue. Is there an opportunity now that you have not seen before, or is it like moments in the past? What do you think?
It's like nothing I've ever seen, and I missed the civil rights era, but I was on, I'm a part of a committee of advisors to the dean of the college on issues of race. It's recently formed. And there's a man on that committee named Joe Trotter, who's a very well-known scholar. He runs his own center at Carnegie Mellon. He's a much older Black man, and he has lived through the civil rights movement. And he said he has seen nothing like this. The energy is different. And that gives me hope, although one wishes that the energy weren't necessary. And I think that it's multi-pronged, right? There are all these factors into why this energy feels different. A part of it is that I think this generation's a lot more aware. Now, that doesn't mean that they are more productive or that they understand things, on a deeper level, but social media has spread concepts and terminology, at least at the most basic level, so that I think people are extremely socially aware. The other thing is that we've all been made to feel like victims of circumstance, right? And I think this is how people who are persecuted feel. I'm being held down by something I can't control. I can't always describe it. People don't believe me, because to admit that it exists, they would have to concede some of their own myth, right? In this country where we prize individualism and exceptionalism, it's hard for some people to say that maybe I got something I didn't deserve, and maybe you deserve better than you have. That goes against a lot of American thinking. But now you have everyone in this boat where it's like, I can't leave the house and I don't know why, because I didn't do anything. I don't deserve this, or I lost my job because of this. And what is this? I can't see it. They tell me it exists. Doctors are telling me about it. Some people on the internet are telling me it's a hoax. I know it's unfair, and I'm trapped and I'm cooped up, and there's this pent up frustration. And so I think some of this frustration has spilled over And it's galvanized, so many people to come together and protest this injustice, this murder of George Floyd, which then is tied to, sort of a history of outcry about racial injustice, social injustice, class injustice, police brutality. And that's encouraging. It's chaotic, it's scary. It's not fun to watch footage of people being hit by cars and having burning down property and throwing garbage cans through windows and that sort of thing. But the language of a riot is a language of oppression and depression. It's what you see outwardly is what has been in people inwardly for so many years: self-loathing, the feeling that you've been denied a chance to actualize yourself as an American citizen, that you didn't have avenues of opportunity. When that's unleashed, you get a really scary picture of what people are dealing with psychologically on a daily basis in this country. And I worry about that because as we get more technologically advanced in this society, and there are fewer jobs for people to do, and climate change is upon us, and there are fewer resources, people become increasingly expendable. And this is what COVID has laid bare more than anything. And I think this is where some of the energy comes from. We have peeled back the layer more than ever to let people know humans are expendable. Individual life has less worth in this country than it has had at any point in this nation, in my life, and during my lifetime. People are admitting this nakedly. When you have people going on TV saying things like, hey, kids need to go back to school, only such and such % will die. It's like, wait a minute, is it acceptable for 14,000 kids to die? And if so, if the sanctity of life doesn't exist versus the sanctity of profits, what does that say about us? Whether you think that says something terrible about us or something practical about us, one must admit it says something definite about us, right? It's a real thing that we need to grapple with. And so I think that this acknowledgement that, hey, I'm a lot more expendable than I thought I was, has galvanized a lot of energy too. I think people are fighting, in their own way for their own individual lives and their livelihoods, and they're staring down a future that's threatening that individual livelihood from so many different directions, So the sense of urgency feels different.
I have to admit that in the earliest days of the COVID epidemic, when we saw who was getting the sickest because of COVID and who was dying first, it looked a lot like the groups that the Nazis went after. It was the elderly, it was the chronically ill. And to me, that was really chilling and made a point of how dangerous this virus is. It doesn't discriminate, but in a way it does. That the impact in communities of color was greater, that the response in those communities was shameful, not providing testing, not providing resources. I find this to be almost like metaphorically an important time, and it has shown all of these problems that we have in our society. It made me think a lot, and this is something I'm seeing more and more of. Communities where we had already talked a lot about childhood trauma or post-traumatic stress or generational transmission of trauma, all of these things, all of that had a missing piece, and that missing piece is attending to mental health. So this is also on my mind. Will we have an appropriate response to mental health needs in communities where that has really been neglected? I mean, do you see practical answers to some of what's going on? Is that possible?
We don't have an appropriate response. I say that confidently because historically we have never had appropriate responses. There's such a stigma about people who seek help for emotional and psychological difficulties, and that's loosened certainly among the more educated people in society. And I don't mean that condescendingly. I mean those fortunate enough to be in circles that are, educated enough that they don't view this as taboo, right? And who have circles that support them rather than deride them. But that hasn't changed on most levels, I don't think. And when you talk about something even, as basic as what these protests are about, which is over-policed communities in America, who are coming face to face daily with officers who, whether they be good police officers or bad police officers, are certainly traumatized police officers who are seeing the worst of the world on a daily basis, who are cleaning up the mess of the world, who are seeing possibly women beaten to a pulp in domestic violence issues and separating people and getting spit on and kicked at, or seeing corpses or people with gunshot wounds. This is the sort of thing in the Army they know you need counseling for. Among police, you need counseling for that too, especially when you're interacting with another community that is impoverished and dealing with their own, psychological and mental stresses that they also are untreated for. We haven't made enough progress in that area. We don't have enough care for the people who do what they call essential work. And that's another thing COVID has laid bare. Not only does it lay bare structural racism, in terms of who it kills and why it's killing them, but it also lays bare this terminology, that essential is somehow tantamount to inconsequential. That as we're calling people essential, what we're saying is, we absolutely need you. Now get your butt out there and do the job regardless of the risk. And those people tend to be poorer people, right? They're disproportionately minorities. They're disproportionately lower class. They need their jobs. They have to wait at the bus stop. They have to take transportation that puts them in close contact with other people. They have to be in stores or in factories where they're in close contact with their fellow workers and with the public day after day after day after day. And we decided that their lives are more expendable than our own. And we're all complicit in that. It hurts to say, I don't think I'm a bad person. And certainly I've been in those positions where I would be considered an expendable, essential person. But at the moment, I'm a university professor and I get to work from home and I can quarantine as much as I want. And then I can run to the store. And when I run to the store, I'm appreciative of the people who work there, but I don't spend every second thinking about how I should thank them and how their lives are on the line. And I do think about these things, but we're all complicit in this system. And when you recognize that you're complicit in the system, that's not to say you need to feel so guilty that you just beat yourself up about it. But you have to think to yourself, there must be a way to make this system better since I'm a part of it. And since I do care about my fellow citizens, right? There have to be measures that one can take. When you start to do that sort of work, then good things happen.
I think that's a really interesting and a good way to approach this moment, especially for anyone who's listening, who's wondering, is interested in helping, wondering where they should be thinking of directing resources or help. Those opportunities are available. And I couldn't agree with you more, Jason. I feel so grateful every day that I get to have my wonderful job and work from inside my house and people deliver my food so I don't have to put myself at risk. I recognize every day that many people are having incredible hardship right now. Many people are at risk every day, especially as we're having a spike now. And I have the luxury of not being in any of those situations where I'm really put at risk. Grateful every day, truly grateful every day. So that's just an important thing for everyone to think about. I would say, what we're experiencing now when many people are really struggling and, their health is at risk. They are vulnerable. They have lost their jobs. Their housing could be at risk. There are many things that we can do.
Sure. And I guess the cliche is to say, that we're as strong as the weakest links of our society, right? So the weakest of us who are struggling, that kind of presages what could happen to us, right? And I think that's the case, that sure, people are losing their jobs and it's awful. And I'm lucky to have mine. But higher education isn't safe. I'm just maybe a year or two safer than higher education. I mean, this entire economy could collapse, and then suddenly we're all in that boat. If we don't tend to the weakest among us, to those we view as disposable, then eventually we will be disposable too. And it's hard sometimes to see that, but there has to be a sense of self-preservation. And I don't know that I'm right about this, but I didn't ever believe in unselfishness. I believed in progressive selfishness, that there was self-interest in each individual, and that it was an intelligent form of selfishness to realize that I need other people in order to be my best self, in order to have my best circumstances, that other people have to thrive as well, right? And that's how I feel about COVID. That I don't view anyone as disposable. If other people are hungry, then eventually that probably portends, my own hunger is around the corner. And it's important to keep that in mind. You may feel untouchable at times, and you may feel like you've succeeded in this country, but history tells us that there are forces waiting to snatch you too. And by you, I mean the general you. Mm-hmm. And historically, this is the sort of work that you do, obviously. And it's the sort of work I try to do as a professor. We have to be aware of the past, because no matter how comfortable you may be in a given moment, it's dangerous to be complacent. Bad faith actors and bad people are never dormant completely. You have to work. It's like being in a relationship. It's like when you're young, you think being in a relationship is magical, because for some reason, at least in my family, my aunts and my uncles and my mom, no one told me the truth. It's like this fairy tale that you find someone you like and it's great. And it turns out that a relationship is a responsibility. It's something you work at. If it's going to be successful, you put effort into it on a daily basis, right? The fight never ends. And if you want something to be good, whether it's your life or a society, the fight never ends. That's why history is so important. You have to instill that in people, because once you forget about history and you become complacent, you are vulnerable to all sorts of attacks, right? And I think we're seeing that. I think some people have been spiritually and metaphorically attacked. They feel, sort of like something has ambushed them. But that thing has always been here, whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, police brutality, inadequate psychological resources. These things are not new. And I'm always surprised when people experience them as new. But it lets me know that we reached a point where the education and the history on these subjects, some people decide it was impertinent, and it's never impertinent.
That and how segregated we still are. I mean, to me, that harkens back to what you were saying about how harmful it is to be segregated. I mean, anyone, and this happened to us at the Holocaust Center after October 27th, 2018, after the shooting. We were interacting with a lot of students who don't know Jewish people, who, from what they learned, really through no fault of their own, from what they learned, thought that anti-Semitism began and ended with the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. So, to see that happen now was really shocking and really disturbing. And so now the way that we teach things has changed. And I mean, we have at the Holocaust Center an opportunity to talk about racism in this country too. I'm guided by history, as is everything that we do. But I think that's exactly right. People who are really shocked by this moment didn't study history, didn't understand what's possible, didn't know about the influenza in 1919, 1920, didn't know that these things have happened, that disease has shut down the world like this is shutting us down. And I feel like more and more often in these conversations, I'm saying that I will wear a mask. Because this is a very important thing. This is science. This is not political. I wear a mask to protect people from me, just in case, even though I've barely gone anywhere. And it's not that much of a hardship. Some people do have breathing problems and shouldn't wear a mask, but for the most of us, we can wear a mask and we're just fine. And it's the right thing to do. It's it shows that you care about other people and that you care about humanity. And it's a simple thing to do. Obviously, I'm getting fired up because I really don't understand why anyone wouldn't just wear a mask. Mm-hmm. It's an easy thing to do. And these are the people who are getting sick, are the people now, young people who are not taking this seriously or feeling that they don't have responsibility for anyone but themselves. And that really is not how it is supposed to be. That's not how a country can succeed.
Sure. It's what you're saying makes me think about citizenship as a concept. Citizenship is a responsibility. It's a benefit that comes with responsibility. It's not something to which you're entitled. It's not like I deserve this. Right? To be a citizen of a society, a member of it, means that you have to uphold the society. And I think we've lost track of that. I'm not going to blame everything on social media. I do think social media has enhanced this delusion that each individual is somehow a celebrity starring in his or her own movie, that the rest of the world is irrelevant. We need the rest of the world. That's how citizenship exists. It exists. Without a society, you can't be a citizen of anything. You can't enjoy the benefits of it, right? And so the responsibility of wearing a mask seems like a very basic one. If that's what the requirement is for me to enjoy my food, for me to enjoy my Netflix subscription or whatever it is that entertains a person, then that seems like a very meager responsibility and easy to fulfill. This hits home because I have an ex-girlfriend who is an astrophysicist. She's in Seattle, and obviously that was the hotbed of COVID early on. And her next door neighbor, she was relaying this to me on Saturday. Her next door neighbors are a little bit older. They have a son who is at University of Washington, and he was part of that group. There was a news story about this fraternity party where 100 people, because they attended, got COVID. And he's back home. And he's jogging around the neighborhood without a mask on because he's asymptomatic. But that doesn't mean he can't give it to someone else. Now, being outdoors seems, to lessen your risk. But my ex-girlfriend was telling me, anytime I interact with this family, who are decent people, they don't believe in conspiracy theories. They don't think the virus is a hoax. But they still, allow their son back at home. They didn't quarantine. Then they had neighbors over. They now have it. The neighbors have it, and she said, these, again, are not bad people. And so she's at an impasse because she's just wondering, what does it take to convince people that this is dangerous? And the parents, of course, now are not asymptomatic. The son is, but the parents are actually sick. They're exhibiting symptoms. And so it's hard. I mean, I struggle with this too. There are lapses, right? I have my mask on whenever I'm out getting groceries, whenever I run errands. And then I get home and there's a psychological feeling that, like, if I just walk over to my porch to talk to you and wave, do I really need it on you? And there are times, again, you slip. I understand that. But to just walk around recklessly, it's unfathomable. And it's a selfishness that actually works against self-preservation. And that's always the weirdest kind of selfishness to me, because it's not a selfishness at all at that point. It's like self-abnegation or something, it's like a death wish. I don't get it.
I don't get it either. And I hope that as time goes on and we're experiencing in southwestern Pennsylvania another spike, whereas before it seemed like we really had it well in hand here. Everybody did what they were supposed to do. And now all of a sudden we have a serious spread of COVID here. I hope that this teaches the lesson that, there are ways that we can minimize this. There are ways that we can get on with our lives, but it's going to take all of us.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's an opportunity for everybody to be a good citizen and to do the right thing. And here's hoping that that's what's going to happen. On a completely different note, I hear my dogs, and I think I'm hearing them through your computer. And I have to say to anyone who's watching, we have 4 dogs, and normally they don't make a peep when I'm on a Zoom. And I've been really proud of them, but they are really barking a lot. So there's a party going on apparently in the backyard. So I'm sorry for that little bit of excitement in the background. Jason, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to tell people or that you wanted to say?
Oh, I suppose I have all kinds of things I could tell people, but I don't know that they'd be appropriate for this context. I have opinions on everything: TV, movies, sports. I don't know. No, I think we've covered what's relevant to the moment and to your organization and the conversations we've had recently, for sure. But if there's anything else that I can give an informed opinion on, or attempt to articulate an informed opinion on, I'm always here next door. You can bring your lovely dogs over, and they can sit here maybe calmly with me. I'd be happy to have their company.
Thank you. Jason, I'm really grateful to you. I have appreciated how open you've been with me in a lot of conversations at this point about what's going on in the world. And it's really so generous of you to talk about all of this with us and with anyone who gets to experience this conversation. And you are a really good neighbor. I just want to say how grateful we are to have you next door. And
well, I appreciate that, and I'm sure Heidi appreciates that quite a bit too.
So, Jason, thank you so much, and just to be continued for sure.
Sure, thank you. It's been a pleasure.